when exactly modern period started. So different scholars had expressed different opinions about the historical specificity of the term modern. Uh, for example, that term modern comes from the Latin modernus, which was used to designate the transition from the pagan civilization to the Christian civilization. So, according to a group of scholars, we can call the Christian period as the modern period in the history of the world. That is one opinion. And some other people, some scholars, thought that the modern period started with the Renaissance, and that was the starting point of modern period, modern age. But to be on the safer side, we can accept a third interpretation of the modern period. That is, the modern period started with the Enlightenment. The modern period started with the Enlightenment. So we shall, soon come to that, area. So this is the significance of the term modern. So it is a historical, fixity. That is what's called. So that fixity itself is under question. That is what's called modern. And then what is modernity then? Modernity refers to certain attitudes that you know uh, make the modern or modern period, that characterize the modern period. So that is what is called a modernity. Certain attitudes, a set of attitudes. And I told you that this kind of a attitudinal change took place after enlightenment. So an attitudinal change took place after enlightenment. And now, what is enlightenment? It was a philosophical, cultural movement that began in the 17th century in England. So in the 17th century. And then even, Francis Bacon contributed much to the, evolution of enlightenment. But later, by the 18th century, this movement it spread all over Europe. Am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yes,
You
sir.
can continue.
I think there was an interruption. That's why I asked. 1 minute. Let me switch off the. Okay. So the Enlightenment, by the 18th century, Enlightenment, this cultural, philosophical movement called Enlightenment, all over Europe. And in fact, the two revolutions, the American Revolution and French Revolution, were influenced by this cultural and philosophical movement. And a lot of philosophers have contributed to the evolution of Enlightenment, like John Locke, Tom Paine, David Hume, Denis Diderot, Voltaire, Goethe, Lessing. And so we can see a large, number of, philosophers contributing to the evolution of this cultural and philosophical movement. And so the overall effect of, enlightenment was a shift in the attitude and sensibility of the people. In the pre-enlightenment age, we can see religion had exercised unquestionable authority in the matters of knowledge. in fact, the entire spectrum of knowledge had been under the control of religion. Education was the monopoly of religion. Medical science was the domain of religion. Psychiatric treatment was the domain of the religion. And then religion was actually all the more powerful in the pre-enlightenment age. So that means at that time, I mean, the pre-enlightenment age, people used the discourses of religion to understand the world. And that was what was special about the pre-enlightenment age. But after enlightenment, there was an epistemic shift. And so there was a shift in the very parameters of knowledge. And so that is the most important effect of enlightenment. And as a result of this shift, people began to think in a rational way. People began to think in a rational way. So reason became, the criterion for, value judgments in the after the enlightenment. So, a scientific rationale developed. And so people rejected religious dogma in favor of a scientific rationale. And they began to consider everything in terms of its scientific, rationale. So that means people, use different thoughts of tools. People use different, tools of thought to think in particular historical situations. So that means our thoughts are not actually objective in any way, because we make use of certain foundations of knowledge to think. So all our thoughts are based on this kind of a discourse, and that is what Foucault called discourse. Some invisible forces that analyze our thoughts in each historical epoch. So that's why I told you that it was an epistemic shift, because episteme is the dominant discourse of a particular period. So that means each historical epoch, certain set of beliefs or certain, discursive regimes with which people think. And that's why, according to Foucault, there are certain statements that are possible at certain historical situations. And for example, in the medieval age, after Ptolemy, the Europeans thought that the earth is flat. The earth is flat. And then Galileo said that no, it is not flat, it is round. So he proved this with his telescope, and then after he invited a professor from the University of Padua to look to the telescope, and he refused because he did not want to upset what he considered as right. Which means the earth is round was not a possible statement as that particular historical situation. But no, the opposite is the case. The earth is flat is not actually possible now. So such, epistemic shift can be seen in the history of the world. And the Enlightenment also, provided, us with that kind of a, epistemic shift. And so people began to think in terms of scientific reasoning, and they developed a kind of scientism that informed the thought process of the people after the Enlightenment. And so again, they rejected, anything that was not actually in conformity with a scientific, system. So they rejected the irrational, on the basis of, scientific reason. So this is what is called enlightenment, a sudden shift in the attitude of the people. They rejected religion, They accepted scientific rationalism, and then they are also developed science and technology, because all these changes in the attitude of the people, the epistemic changes, brought about the development of science and technology. So, as a result of enlightenment, secular education began to uh, be very powerful, and so it emerged as a very powerful system, that is secular education. So that means education was liberated from religious dogma, and so it helped the development of secular education. So science and technology developed because of all these things. And another impact of the science and technology is the Industrial Revolution. So machines were invented. A large number of gadgets were invented because of the scientific developments, technological developments. So the Industrial Revolution started, and the Industrial Revolution, culminated in the emergence of a very powerful class in the world, that is the capitalist class. So capitalism as an economic, mode of production evolved. All these were, the results of enlightenment, what we now call enlightenment. So that means enlightenment gave emphasis on three, distinct aspects of human culture. One is truth. So that means everything should be taken on the basis of its truth value. So when a person says anything, so that is considered or that is accepted on the basis of its truth value. So that truth becomes an aspect of culture. And normative rightness. So that means this is something related to the morality, the normative rightness. Anything moral, because religion had actually withdrawn from the scene. So the moral guidance should be ensured by this kind of enlightenment ethics. So moral righteousness, where was given importance. Then authenticity and beauty, that actually took place in the aesthetic realm, that is in literature and art. These these entities, that is authenticity and beauty, became very important. So a work of art should be authentic, should be original. And so that is taken for granted on the basis of authenticity, that is its authenticity. A work of art is taken for granted on the basis of its authenticity and also its beauty. So new aspects of culture developed as a result of the Enlightenment. So this, all these, can be considered as part of what we now call modernity. And modernity again developed, I told you, reasoning attitude and democracy too, because a democratic impulse was there in the Enlightenment principles. So a concern for democratic principles also developed due to the Enlightenment. And then another feature of modernity is the urbanization. That means by the end of the 19th century, more than 80% of the British population lived in the cities. The city had devoured the country in England and in most of the European states. And so there was the accumulation of people in the cities. That was also a feature of modernity, the accumulation of people in the cities. And then the modernity was based on, again, the principle of minimalism. What is minimalism? There is no excess, that means they believe in the minimum. So that is what's called the minimalism. No extravagance, not no luxury, and so they believe in what is called minimalism, or the the least with regard to anything. And so again, and I shall make it clear in the next slide. So again, they have developed, a concern for human rights, then justice, democracy, and all these things developed after Enlightenment. And then, in short, we can see that modernity set new aims, new attitudes, and new priorities for the people. And that's what's called modernity. And in the 20th century, what happened is that all these cultural changes uh, uh, began to be reflected in the area of human expression, that is in art and literature. And so traditional methods of expression became inadequate to portray the complexities of the time. And so the artists and writers looked for innovative techniques in their respective fields. So that means, uh, that was why once Virginia Woolf said, in or around 1910, human nature changed. So the writer became baffled, confused at the new kind of complex realities in the world. And so traditional methods of expression became inadequate to portray that kind of a complex reality. The society was fragmented because, um, naturally, um, uh, the British society lost what Dr. F.R. Lewis called organic communities. And organic communities used to exist. And so industrial, communities, emerged. And the criterion of value in the industrial society is money. That is the only criterion of value in the industrial society. So because of all these things, the writer lost that vantage point from which to look at social reality. So he, looked for innovative techniques. And so all these, impulses culminated in the evolution of what is called modernism. So we can say that modernism is an aesthetic tendency. It is an aesthetic tendency. It is something that happens in art and literature. So that's called modernism. It's an aesthetic movement. And so, as an aesthetic movement, modernism manifests modernity. So that changed the attitudes of the people. And so, in modern art and modern literature, we can see some kind of an autonomy. It is an autonomous art and literature became autonomous in modernism. How? Because in realist art or in the pre-modernist art, we can see that art faithfully represents the reality. Art faithfully represents reality, which means art was attached to reality in the pre-modernist age. So that means when Wordsworth wrote Daffodils, he was actually faithfully portraying the flower. So it was invested with a lot of philosophical meanings. But in the pre-modernist art, we can see a correspondence between the art and reality. And that was again the basic principle of realism in painting and realism in literature. So art was, inseparably, inextricably attached to reality in the pre-modernist age. But what happened in modernism is that uh, the very concept of reality was put under question. The very concept of reality was put under question. So naturally, um, there was, a detachment. There was a detachment with the reality. So art got detached from reality in modernism. So that is why art became autonomous, and it no longer represented reality. It is cut off from the real. And this can be seen in the novels of Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann, Andre Gide, Marcel Proust, and all, and James Joyce, Virginia Woolf. Then in the poems of T.S. Eliot. So their works can be considered as autonomous works of art. They have existence of, as only as objects of art. And then at the same time, it is not possible for us to define what modernism is, because it is a very multi-dimensional event, and so which cannot be confined to a single definition. And so, in short, but we can say that modernism is a composite culture. It is a composite culture. It refers to a series of innovative techniques in narratology in literature, innovative techniques of representation in painting. And then another thing is that modernism mounts the fragmentation, which was the characteristic experience of the time, and also the loss of that kind of an organic society. And so here, people became fragmented. The life became fragmented because of so many systems. Each person became an island to himself in the modernist world. But in the pre-modern stage, people were interlocked by so many systems. And so there was fragmentation in life. And then they mount the fragmentation that had taken place in the society. In all modernist texts, we can see an underlying strain of sadness. An underlying strain of sadness in all modernist works, whether it be Kafka's Metamorphosis, Trial, America, or The Castle, or the Death in Venice of Thomas Mann. In all these modernist texts, we can see an underlying strain of sadness because it mounts fragmentation and the loss of an organic society. And also in modernism, there was a demarcation between the popular and the pop. The popular and high art. The pop and the high art. So that means in modernism, there was again a divide in literature. Because a new sort of literature, because of the universalization of education, and because of compulsory education, the policies of compulsory education adopted in Europe, people became literate. And as the rate of literacy increased, people turned to reading, because that was the only pastime at that time. That means that was the only way to pass their time at that time. There was no mobile phone, no internet, no television, so they turned to reading. But the people's sensibility was not sharp and aesthetically conditioned. That means the sensibility of these newly literate people. So to cater to their emotional needs, a new sort of literature developed, that is pop literature, mass culture or mass literature or popular culture, popular journalism, then a lot of pulp novels with full of melodramatic events, even pornographic details and the like. So that is actually the development of a parallel sort of literature. So naturally, they have developed a divide in literature between the pop and the high art. And so this was clearly, distinguished in modernism. And again, modernism had a suspicion of the pop. The modernists were suspicious of the pop, and I mean popular art. And again, in modernism, there was an emphasis on how we see rather than what we see. And again, minimalism was also there in modernism too. So that means this can be seen in the architecture. Modernism as a cultural movement or an aesthetic movement was not confined to the realm of literature and art alone. All avenues of human expression were affected by modernism. There is modernism in painting, modernism in architecture, and so the beautiful, spacious Victorian buildings were replaced with geometrically shaped buildings. So the Victorian buildings were, really marked for their, beauty. And the rooms were very spacious with huge windows and huge doors. In Toronto itself, there are a lot of examples of Victorian buildings. The VJT Hall, the State Central Library, University College, and all these buildings were examples of Victorian architecture, with huge rooms, spacious rooms with huge windows that ensured air circulation and all such things. That was traditional architecture. But also, all those traditional forms of architecture were replaced, and new geometrically shaped buildings emerged. And so this is the difference. On one side, we can see a Victorian building, and on the right, we can see a modern building, which is geometrically, designed. And again, this is how modernism manifests itself in painting. So on the left side, you can see a realist painting, the Gleanish, a realist painting. And on the other side, the right side, we can see that famous painting by Picasso. So this is how modernist art, becomes detached, becomes autonomous. And the emphasis is on how we see rather than what we see. That is in modernism. And then, we have now discussed three terms: modern, modernism, modernity, and modernism. Okay. Now, again, we need to consider three more terms: postmodern, postmodernity, and postmodernism. So here, as a historical entity, postmodern refers to, again, there are differences of opinion among scholars about the beginning of postmodern age. But anyhow, let us, see the beginning of postmodern age in the year 1972. So what is the significance of that, age? So in 1972, a huge, apartment in a flat, a huge, flat complex in Pruitico in the United States was demolished with controlled explosion by the government. So that took place in 1972. The demolition of this building, this huge complex. with controlled explosion by the government. That took place in 1972, and this was again one of the um, emblematic buildings of modernism, modern architecture. So the building was, demolished using, a controlled explosion. So why? Because this was a huge, complex designed by I forgot his name, and it was he who designed the World Trade Center also. And so this was definitely a, an emblem of modernist architecture, and it was destroyed because, even after, the completion of the work, uh, I mean, the majority of the apartments were, unoccupied. People were not ready to occupy the houses. That's the problem. So they even started a school inside the complex, but without much success. And somehow there was something intimidating about the building, and so people refused to occupy the apartments. So the government, announced a lot of subsidies and the like, loan subsidies and the like. Still, the majority of the apartments were unoccupied. Soon it became the center of criminal activities, and a lot of such things. And so finally, the government appointed a committee of experts, including architects, psychologists, sociologists, and the like. And finally, they submitted the report, and it is said that there was something, uh, intimidating about that building, that is, the flat. So the government decided to demolish it. And so that took place in 1972. And so that means this was I told you, the emblem of modernist architecture. So that means, according to a theorist called Charles Jens, this marked the death of modernism. This marked the death of modernism. So naturally, we can say that postmodernism was born not with a whimper, but with a bang. So that was in 1972. That is in Pro Ego. And now, what is postmodernity? Postmodernity, is characterized by a lot of complex, events. One is what is called the post-industrialism. Post-industrialism was a term coined by the American theorist, Daniel Bell. We shall soon see him. So, post-industrialism. So, the industrial society was replaced by what is called the post-industrial society in postmodernity. So, what is meant by post-industrial society? In the post-industrial society, the service sector and the information industry became, all the more powerful. They became very powerful. The service sector and information industry. So that means day-to-day life began to be mediated through the computer interface in postmodernity. Shopping can be done through the computer interface. So even our day-to-day activities, the day-to-day life became mediated through the computer interface. And in postmodernity, there was a preference to the pop culture. So that means there was a kind of hierarchy in modernism. That means, modernists believe in high art. They were suspicious of the pop artists. And here in postmodernity, there was a preference for the pop, which means in the place of the modern hierarchy, here we can see anarchy, a preference to anarchy. And also postmodernity started with a critique of reasoning, legitimacy, and the like. So postmodernism developed a distrust in reason, legitimacy, and all such things. See, modernism was based on reason, scientific rationalism, and the like. But in the case of scientific rationalism, in postmodernity, we can see a critique of reason, legitimacy, and the like. So that was why, the postmodernist theorist Jean-Francois Lyotard defined postmodernism as the incredulity to meta-narratives. He defined postmodernism as the incredulity to meta-narratives. So the meta-narratives fail to explain in the postmodern world. So what is a meta-narrative? So meta-narrative is a grand narrative, a big narrative within which we can see a lot of micro-narratives. So meta-narratives function as something that give a validity and meaning to our actions, our thoughts, and our statements. And that's what's called meta-narratives. And it is a narrative that includes a lot of mini narratives. So, for example, take the case of democracy. So, democracy is a meta narrative that includes a lot of micro narratives. So, we believe the fact, at least we say that we believe that all are equal. Why? So, we believe in equality. We believe in the narrative of equality. Why? Because we are living in a democratic country. We are living in a democratic country. And we are actually conditioned by democratic principles. So the concept of fraternity or the equality, and those narratives of equality and fraternity can be seen within the narrative of democracy. Religion can be a meta-narrative. So that means a meta-narrative, they can offer an explanation to anything and everything related to life. And so the post-war world witnessed the destruction of that kind of a meta-narrative, because people became incredulous to meta-narratives. Because the world witnessed the failure of meta-narratives. Narcissism failed. Then again, religion failed. And so people became incredulous, about meta-narratives. So this is what is called the postmodern condition according to Lyotard. And then what happened to subjectivity? The subjectivity was actually based on, that very concept of subjectivity was based on enlightenment reason in modernism. The unified human subject, a unified human agent, a unified human subject. So that was an enlightenment legacy, which was very powerful in the modern age, in modernism or in modernity. But what happened to that kind of a unified subjectivity here in the postmodern world? So that means that postmodern subject is scrambled into schizophrenia. So that is what happened in postmodernism. That subjectivity, a unified human subjectivity, is actually scrambled, actually divided into pieces. And this is what is called the schizophrenia of postmodernity. And that is also another difference between modernity and postmodernity. Modernity was characterized by hysteria, because they mourn the loss of an organic society and the like. So they mourn over the loss of certain values, certain systems, and the like. And so was the hysteric reminiscences. But in the place of hysteria, modernist hysteria, in postmodernity, we can see schizophrenia. The subjectivity, the self is actually fragmented into bits. And so, because we are living in a very complicated digital age, where it is quite impossible to spot a unified identity, a unified subjectivity. And even knowledge is now processed as information, and information in the computer. And knowledge can be disseminated through computer codes. So knowledge is transformed into information in the postmodern age. And naturally, there is a loss of originality, authenticity. And that is postmodernism. And postmodernism believe in irony and pastiche. So postmodernism believe in parody and pastiche. And so in postmodernism, and again, just like modernism, postmodernism is also a kind of aesthetic principle and aesthetic situation. So here in postmodern art, we can see the celebration of fragmentation. And in modern art, we can see the mourning of fragmentation. But here we can see the celebration of fragmentation and preference for the pop culture, a loss of authenticity, parody, pastiche, self-reflexivity, pluralism, excess, and all in the place of modernist minimalism. Here we can see the excess, an emphasis on the excess, self-reflexivity, pluralism. All these characterized what is called postmodernism. And so this was Jean-Francois. This is Jean-Francois Lyotard, and another philosopher was Jean Baudrillard. And because of the constraints of time, I'm actually skipping all these things. And so this is the difference between modern and the postmodern architecture. On one side, we can see modernist architecture, and on the other side, you can see the steel building that was, again, an emblem of postmodern architecture. So here we can see the excess, not minimalism, but the excess. Excess can be seen. And then another is pastiche, the loss of originality that resulted in pastiche. So they were actually not bothered about authenticity or originality. So because here we can see the disintegration of reason in postmodernism, scientific, rational, or all such things, whatever it is. So originality was questioned. So they became involved in what is called, they got involved in parody and pastiche. So pastiche, parody, pastiche is also a kind of parody, but the difference is that in pastiche, there is no object of satire or no satirical object or something like that. Parody is directed against a particular person or a particular tendency. It has a target. It has a satiric elements too. But in the case of pastiche, no such target, no such satiric elements. And so it is somewhat neutral. And the example can be seen here. On the left side, you can see the famous painting of Van Gogh, Vincent Van Gogh's sunflowers. So this is the original painting, Van Gogh's painting. And on the right side, you can see the painting by a very important, famous painter of England, David Hockney. David Hockney's sunflowers on the right side. So this is what is called the pastiche, and this can be seen in postmodern art. So that means thinking about Jürgen Habermas becomes valid in this kind of a context, because here Habermas was born in 1929, a German philosopher. And so let us again go back to that modernist situation. So modernism was the prominent, became very powerful and prominent in the first half of the 20th century. But in the 1940s, in the late 1940s, there took place certain events, and basically, that means the publication of 3 major works. One was Martin Heidegger's essay on humanism, that was published in 1946. And another was the questions concerning technology, published in 1949, again an essay by Martin Heidegger. And then another text is quite familiar to us all, that is the Dialectic of Enlightenment, published by Horkheimer and Adorno, jointly written by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno in 1947. So what is special about this book is that it questions the Enlightenment, rationalism. So this book questions Enlightenment rationalism. So that is what's called the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and that influential essay, Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception, and that essay was included in this book, the Dialectic of Enlightenment. So here, Horkheimer questions the very concept of enlightenment, rationalism. So why? So that is, the significance of the title, the dialectic of enlightenment. In the enlightenment process, we can see a kind of Hegelian dialectics. How? So that title, enlightenment as mass deception, is also very important here. So how enlightenment proved to be a deception, a mass deception? And what is the dialectic involved in enlightenment? In Hegelian dialectics, there are three movements: the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis. So consider the situation in the pre-enlightenment age. Religion was all the more powerful. It was the age of religious dogma. And if we can see that kind of a situation as the thesis, enlightenment was its antithesis. Enlightenment, with its new rationalism, scientific reasoning, and all such things, offered an antithesis to that kind of a thesis. Then, what happened after enlightenment? That is very curious indeed. So, religion was completely replaced with science, and what happened was that science began to behave like a religion, and it expressed all the features of religion. There was a kind of fanaticism there is a kind of fanaticism in religion. In science, they are not ready to accept anything that is not actually valid according to their kind of reasoning and the like. So there was a distrust of anything, beyond their logic in science. So science is fanatic in that respect. And so it has its own followers. And even capitalism began to behave like a religion. See what happened in late capitalism. So almost all the leading companies of the world can be considered as a kind of religion. Take any company, like religion, it has an emblem. Like religion, it has a uniform architectural structure, architectural shape. So take the case of the Apple company. So the offices of the Apple all over the world, have some similar, structure, similarity among them. There is, that means that design is rather somewhat similar and homogeneous, and it has an emblem. It has a lot of followers too, like religion, a lot of followers, the consumers. So that means after enlightenment, all these things began to behave like religion. And this can be considered as a perfect synthesis. So that is the dialectic. The thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis can be seen in the case of enlightenment also. And enlightenment set new orthodoxies, new conservatism. Hello. So this is what happened to enlightenment in the modern age. So we can see that this is the dialectic of enlightenment.
Okay.
Hello? Hello? Is there any? Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible. You can continue.
There is some kind of a disturbance, I think. Somebody's mic
Yeah,
is on. That's it.
Ananya, please switch off your mic. Ananya, if you can hear me. Okay, sir, you can continue.
Okay. So then, so that is what happened to enlightenment. So it proved to be a kind of mass deception. And again, through culture industry, people became deceived. People became deceived through culture industry too. And so thus, the very logic of enlightenment, that is reasoning, what put under question by Horkheimer and Adorno in the dialectic of enlightenment. So then again, 1933, when Hitler came to power, this movement was banned in Germany. The Frankfurt School was banned in Germany. And then, the movement was, the Frankfurt School was located in the United States. And again, then, Horkheimer coined the term critical theory because they were critical of all these things. I mean, like reasoning, rationalism, and the like. So then, after the war, or after the fall of Hitler, again, the Frankfurt School restarted in Frankfurt, Germany. And so it was initiated by definitely Horkheimer and Adorno. And it was at this time Habermas joined the Frankfurt School. So he joined Frankfurt School and he became a member of Frankfurt School. So here, again, he at the same time, he was not ready to, accept some aspects of the theories of Adorno and Horkheimer. And then, so naturally, this critique of scientific rationalism, reason, and all such things were carried forward in the second half of the 20th century by the post-structuralist philosophers, Derrida and Foucault. So they too continued this critique of reasoning. So that means Derrida, declared that everything is constructed. Everything, even reason, is a kind of construct. This reason is a kind of construct. And Foucault said that behind all such kind of constructionism, we can see the genealogy of power. If we approach the genealogy, if we trace the genealogy of such kind of constructionism, we can see different kinds of power relationships. So that means that very notion of reason, the rationalism, were questioned by post-structuralism too. And so that means, according to Foucault, there is no reason, neither reason nor unreason. And everything is actually a construct, something constructed by the humans. And so that means this is actually what contributed to the evolution of postmodernism. This distrust or this questioning of a kind of monolithic reasoning can be considered as the foundation of postmodernism. And again, this kind of critique of reasoning was continued forward by a new group evolved in the United States called neoconservatism. And an important exponent of neoconservatism was Daniel Bell, the man who coined the term post-industrialism. So the new conservatives were, very skeptical about scientific reasoning and modernist reasoning. So they actually stood for a free market policy, they supported capitalism, and they developed a kind of hostility to enlightenment. And so that means what happened was that, according to Habermas, the new conservatives was actually playing a trick because they placed the blame of the unwelcome consequences of big capitalism on modernity. So that is what neoconservatives like Daniel Bell did. So he placed the unwelcome consequences of capitalism on modernity and modern culture. And then, so this was actually the critique of Daniel Bell. He said that the impulse of modernity is exhausted. It is exhausted. Modernity is exhausted. And so that means, as a principle, it was once dominant, but now dead. So this was actually what Daniel Bell said. So behind all these things, we can see the influence of Foucault, Derrida, and such post-structuralist philosophers. And then Habermas' project is to save modernity. That is a thing. So he wanted to save modernity from the postmodern attack. So he was speaking in defense of modernity. And so here he said that still modernity is relevant. It is not that it is still an incomplete project. It has not actually fulfilled its aims, purposes. So it is still incomplete in that sense. So that means what happened is that there is actually a kind of split in reasoning. So that means he said his first task is to develop a comprehensive conception of reason, a comprehensive concept of reason. So that is a concept which is not reducible to the instrumental technical evaluations or calculations of an individual subject. So here he identified three categories of knowledge, which can correspond to three anthropologically rooted interests of human beings. Three categories of knowledge that can correspond to three anthropologically rooted interests of human beings. So one is the technical control of the world, and the second is the understanding others, and the third is freedom from structures of domination. So these are the anthropologically rooted interests of human beings. Why? So first, human beings wish for the control of the world. They wish for the control of nature. So for that, they developed technology. So that is what's called the technical control of the world. The secondly, to develop a kind of consensus among themselves, among people. So that is an understanding among themselves. And that is the second anthropological rooted interest of human beings, to develop understanding. And that is what's called the practical category of knowledge. And the third is freedom from structures of domination. So that is to be free. So that is actually a deep-rooted interest of human beings. So that means we have three areas of knowledge: technical, practical, and emancipatory. So these are the three interests of human beings. And then what happened in the modernity is that there was an unbalanced expansion of the technical interest in control. So these three were there, but amongst the three, one element became all the more powerful, and one element became more powerful than others. And that is what he termed as the unbalanced expansion of the technical interest in control. And so this is actually what happened to reasoning in the modern age, in modernity, an unbalanced expansion of technical interest. So in modernity, what is more powerful and strong is definitely the technical interest of human beings. So that means the other two were neglected. So that is the understanding others, that is the practical and the emancipatory categories of knowledge were not given that much importance. So that was what happened to scientific reasoning. And then, what is the solution to this kind of a problem? Again, Habermas offered the solution to, he said that this can be solved by asserting the, potentialities of the other two categories of knowledge. That is the, emancipatory and the, the other one, that is the practical and the understanding, categories of knowledge. So by reinforcing them, we can solve this kind of an imbalance in the reasoning power of mind. And so that means this a kind of validity depends on communicative competence. So a validity can be made dependent on a kind of communicative competence. And so that means modern culture has made available in a kind of rationalized life world. So modern, modernity has made available a kind of rationalized world. So where we can see three different areas. That is the scientific rationale, moral, legal, and aesthetic expressive. So here, what happens is that in modernity, the life world is divided into three areas corresponding to the three categories of knowledge. The first one is scientific technical category. The second one is the moral legal category, that is actually related to the interpersonal relationships among people. And the third one is the aesthetic expressive, which is related to the emancipatory, or in another way related to art and literature. So divisions are there. So the life world was divided into three: the scientific, technical, moral, legal, and aesthetic expressive. So this in resulted in the development of three value systems in modernity. That is truth, rightness, and truthfulness. Truth, rightness, and truthfulness. And so here again, what happened is that this kind of a failure of modernity can be solved through what Habermas introduced as communicative rationality or communicative action. And what is meant by communicative rationality and what communicative action? So that means by developing a kind of communication among these three spheres of validity. So that means communication is very important. So here he reversed that old concept of speech. We often say that speech is for understanding. Speech is for understanding. Okay, speech is not only for understanding according to Habermas, but understanding is necessary for speech. Speech is not only for understanding, but understanding, on the contrary, understanding is also necessary for speech. Without a kind of understanding, a communicative rationality, we cannot actually arrive at any solutions. So that means there are a lot of discussions on arguments between the the atheist and the non-atheist. A lot of arguments are there between the atheists and the non-atheists or the believers. Such arguments will not reach anywhere. Why? Because they are speaking two logics. No communicative rationale is there. And to be meaningful, we need what is called a communicative action, which means a communicative rational underlying patterns of communication that may result in a kind of action. So that means a consensus can be thus developed among three different validity claims like truth, rightness, and truthfulness. This is what Habermas said. And so thus he criticized conservatism with neoconservatism, because neoconservatism put the blame of what I have already told you, the unwelcome consequences of the capitalist society on modernity. And so here, according to Habermas, three kinds of people can be identified, three groups of people can be identified. The young conservatives who are anti-modern and they supported a kind of descended subjectivity that include Bataille, then Foucault and Derrida. And then there can be an old conservative, a group of old conservatives like the new Aristotelians like Leo Strauss, Hans Jones, and Robert Speyman. And then there can be the neoconservatives, as we have seen, Daniel Bell, Wittgenstein, Carl Schmitt, Gottfried Benn. So he concludes his essay with the argument that still the potential for modernity has not been exhausted, because still it has the potentiality for reasoning. Through a communicative rationality, we can actually reinstate modernity, because the potential for modernity, for reasoning, for democratic impulses, and all such things cannot be ignored. And so, as a an important, a very potential discourse of humanity. So we cannot actually say that modernity has lost its relevance, because it is still relevant, because its ideas, especially related to a kind of reasoning, a kind of democratic setup, and all these things are still valid in the postmodern age. So there is no point in arguing that modernity is an incomplete project according to uh, uh, Habermas. Okay, I think it's time, and we shall stop here, and we shall, if